The wind carried whispers across the Montana plains. But Dr. Ethan Blackwood had stopped listening to them long ago. He knelt between two weathered headstones, his calloused hands placing fresh wildflowers on graves that had known too many seasons of his solitude. The morning sun painted the hillside in shades of gold, but all Ethan saw was the gray of memory. "I killed them both," he whispered to the stone markers, the words falling like stones into the vast silence. "William, Sarah, my hands, my choices." The brass key around his neck caught the light as he bowed his head. 5 years since the war ended. 3 years since Sarah had closed her eyes for the last time, choosing faith over his medicine. 8 years since he'd held a gun to his brother's temple and pulled the trigger rather than watch infection consume him slowly. Some wounds never healed. Some guilt was a companion for life. Ethan rose, brushing dirt from his knees, and turned back toward his farmhouse. The structure stood solid against the wilderness, weathered but enduring, much like the man who built it. He'd chosen this isolation deliberately, far from towns and neighbors, far from the temptation to practice medicine again. His hands had dealt enough death disguised as mercy. The morning routine beckoned: coffee, bread, the simple tasks that filled empty hours. But as Ethan crested the small hill between the cemetery and his home, something broke the pattern that had sustained him for 3 years. Smoke rose from his chimney, smoke he hadn't lit. His hand moved instinctively to the Winchester rifle propped against the porch post as he approached. Through the window, shadows moved within his kitchen. 2 figures, one small, one medium height. His jaw tightened. In this territory, uninvited guests often brought trouble with bullets as currency. Ethan eased the front door open, rifle ready. The scent hit him first: blood, fear, and beneath it the softer smell of a child. A woman sat slumped at his kitchen table, dark hair matted with sweat, one hand pressed against her shoulder where crimson stained her torn dress. Beside her, a small girl clutched a raggedy doll, watching Ethan with eyes too old for her young face. "Please," the woman whispered, not lifting her head, "we won't trouble you long." Just until, her words dissolved into labored breathing. Ethan lowered the rifle slightly, his medical training warring with hard-earned caution. The woman was pale, clearly weakened by blood loss. The child remained perfectly still, but those dark eyes tracked his every movement with unnerving intensity. "Who's after you?" Ethan asked, not moving closer. "My father-in-law," the woman managed. "Jeremiah Keller. We ran from the path." The name hit Ethan like a physical blow. Jeremiah Keller, the path of salvation. Memories cascaded through him. Sarah's final words about divine healing. William's fevered ravings about purification through suffering. The newspaper clippings he'd collected about missing persons last seen at religious gatherings. "You're bleeding," he said flatly, setting the rifle aside. His hands moved without conscious decision, gathering clean rags from a drawer, lighting the oil lamp for better visibility. "Sit still." The woman, Rachel, she whispered when he asked, watched him with something like wonder as he cleaned and examined her wound. A knife cut, deep but clean, already showing signs of proper clotting. She'd lost blood but would survive with basic care. "You have gentle hands," Rachel observed, wincing as he sutured the wound. "Like a doctor." Ethan's needle paused for just a moment. "I was, once." The child, Rebecca, hadn't spoken a word, but she watched him work with that same unsettling focus. When Ethan glanced at her, she held up a piece of paper she'd been drawing on. His blood chilled at the crude but unmistakable image: a man with a gun pointed at another man's head. Both figures clearly meant to be him and someone else. Someone with lighter hair and a slighter build. "William, how?" Ethan began, but Rebecca had already turned to a fresh sheet, her small hands moving with swift, certain strokes. This drawing showed the same 2 men, but the one with the gun was crying. Below the image, in a child's careful letters, "It wasn't your fault." The room went silent except for the soft scratch of pencil on paper and Rachel's controlled breathing as Ethan finished his work. When he tied off the final suture, his hands were trembling slightly. "Who is she?" he asked Rachel quietly, nodding toward Rebecca. "What is she?" Rachel's arm tightened protectively around her daughter. "She's just a little girl who sees things sometimes. Jeremiah calls it a divine gift. I call it a burden no child should carry." Ethan capped the iodine bottle with deliberate movements, buying time to process what he'd witnessed. The drawing was too accurate, too specific. No one knew about William except. She drew my brother, he said finally. Something that happened 8 years ago. Something no one alive knows about. Rebecca draws what she sees, Rachel said softly. Past, present, future, it's all the same to her sometimes. That's why Jeremiah wants her back. Why he'll never stop hunting us. As if summoned by her name, Rebecca looked up from her latest drawing and fixed Ethan with those penetrating eyes. He's coming, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The silver man with fire in his hands. Tonight, when the moon is dark. Ethan felt the walls of his carefully constructed isolation crumbling. For 3 years, he'd managed to avoid the world's complications, to exist in a bubble of routine and solitude. Now the outside world had found him anyway, bringing with it a wounded mother, a child who saw too much, and the specter of a man whose name alone conjured memories of loss and helplessness. You can't stay here, he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. I don't get involved in other people's troubles. Rachel's laugh held no humor. With respect, Dr. Blackwood, I think you've been involved in Jeremiah's troubles longer than you realize. Something in her tone made him look at her sharply. What do you mean? Instead of answering, Rachel reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. Yellowed with age, she placed it on the table between them. Ethan recognized his own name written in flowing script across the front, and beneath it. A date that made his heart skip. June 15, 1865, 2 weeks before William had taken fever. 2 weeks before everything fell apart. With hands that didn't feel quite steady, Ethan unfolded the letter. The handwriting was elegant, formal, unmistakably that of an educated man. Dr. Ethan Blackwood, I write to inform you of your brother William's remarkable recovery under my care. The infection that your field medicine could not cure has yielded to prayer and divine intervention. William speaks often of your dedication, your sacrifice, your willingness to bear any burden for his welfare. Such devotion is precious and rare. When the war ends, you both would find welcome in our community. We believe in healing, not just of the body, but of the spirit. William has found peace here that medical science never provided. Yours in faith, Jeremiah Keller. The letter slipped from Ethan's nerveless fingers. The room seemed to tilt. Reality reshaping itself around this impossible revelation. This is dated before William died. Before the fever broke him. Jeremiah has been watching your family for years, Rachel said gently. He collects people who've suffered loss, who blame themselves for things beyond their control. He finds them when they're most vulnerable and offers them exactly what they need to hear. Ethan stared at the letter, his mind reeling. If Jeremiah had been in contact with William before the infection, before the mercy killing that had haunted Ethan for 8 years, William never mentioned this man. Never spoke of any religious community. Because he was protecting you, Rebecca said suddenly, setting down her pencil. Her latest drawing showed a young man in a blue uniform, kneeling beside a grave with tears streaming down his face. He knew the silver man was dangerous. He tried to keep you safe. The child's words hit Ethan like a physical blow. All these years, he'd carried the weight of William's death, the guilt of that final choice. But if Jeremiah had been influencing his brother, if there were forces at work beyond what Ethan had understood. Sarah, he whispered suddenly, another piece clicking into place. My wife. She started talking about divine healing near the end. Refusing surgery, refusing medicine. He looked at Rachel with growing horror. She mentioned a preacher she'd been corresponding with. A man who promised miracles for those with sufficient faith. Rachel's expression confirmed his worst fears. Jeremiah's reach extends far beyond Montana territory. He has followers, sympathizers, agents throughout the Western Territories. People who identify potential recruits. People who've suffered loss or trauma. The brass key around Ethan's neck felt suddenly heavy. Sarah's final gift to him. Or so he'd thought. A key to the safe deposit box where she'd kept her most precious belongings. He'd never opened it, couldn't bear to face another reminder of his failure to save her. What's in the box, Dr. Blackwood? Rebecca asked softly, though he hadn't spoken aloud. What did she leave for you to find? Before Ethan could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed across the plains. Multiple horses, moving fast toward his isolated farmhouse. Rachel went pale, instinctively pulling Rebecca closer. "They found us," she breathed. "Somehow they tracked us here." Ethan moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains. 6 riders approached through the late afternoon light, moving with military precision. At their head rode a tall figure with silver hair that caught the dying sunlight, a man whose very presence seemed to command the landscape around him. Jeremiah Keller. After all these years, after all the nightmares and guilt and carefully constructed distance, the architect of his family's destruction had come calling. "The root cellar," Ethan said tersely, his military training asserting itself. "Behind the pantry. There's a hidden door. Take Rebecca and wait there until I call for you." "No." Rachel's voice was firm despite her fear. "We run together or we stand together. I won't hide while you face him alone." Ethan started to argue, then caught sight of Rebecca's latest drawing. It showed his farmhouse surrounded by men on horseback. But there was something different about this image. The men weren't advancing, they were waiting. And in the doorway of the house stood a lone figure. Not cowering but standing tall. A small brass key gleaming at his throat. "He's not here to attack," Rebecca said quietly. "He's here to talk. To make you an offer." The hoofbeats stopped just outside the farmhouse. Voices carried on the evening air. Too low to make out words but clear in their tone of authority and patience. Ethan checked his rifle, ensuring it was loaded, then moved toward the front door. "Stay behind me," he told Rachel, "and whatever happens, whatever he offers, remember that nothing Jeremiah Keller promises comes without a price." Ethan opened the door and stepped onto his porch, rifle held casually but ready. The riders had arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around his property, blocking the obvious escape routes but maintaining a respectful distance. Professional, disciplined, the bearing of men accustomed to following orders. Jeremiah Keller remained mounted at the center of the formation, and Ethan's first glimpse of the man sent a chill through him. This wasn't the wild-eyed fanatic he'd imagined based on newspaper accounts and Rachel's fear. This was a figure of obvious intelligence and charisma, silver-haired and elegant even in travel clothes, with the kind of magnetic presence that drew others into his orbit. "Dr. Ethan Blackwood," Jeremiah called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "I've waited many years for this moment." "Then you can wait a little longer," Ethan replied evenly. "State your business and move on." Jeremiah's smile was warm, grandfatherly, completely at odds with the armed men surrounding Ethan's home. "My business, doctor, is with the woman and child you're harboring. They belong to my community. My spiritual family. I've come to bring them home. They don't seem to want to go." "Of course not. They've been frightened, confused by lies and misunderstanding." Jeremiah's tone remained gentle, reasonable. "But I think you, of all people, understand the pain of losing family to senseless tragedy. The guilt of failing to protect those you love most." The words hit their mark with surgical precision. Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle, but he kept his voice level. "I understand that you're trespassing on my property. I understand that these people came here seeking shelter, and I'm inclined to provide it. Even knowing what it might cost you?" Jeremiah asked, and something subtle shifted in his manner. The grandfatherly warmth remained, but underneath it, Ethan caught a glimpse of iron will and absolute certainty. "I know about William, doctor. I know about the choice you made in that field hospital. The weight you've carried ever since." Ethan's blood chilled, but he forced himself to show no reaction. "My brother died of infection 8 years ago. Nothing more to know." "Your brother died because you put a pistol to his head and pulled the trigger," Jeremiah said softly, "because you couldn't bear to watch him suffer. Couldn't find the strength to let nature take its course. It was an act of love, doctor, but it was also an act of murder." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Behind Ethan, he heard Rachel's sharp intake of breath, felt rather than saw Rebecca moving closer to the door. But all his attention was focused on the silver-haired man whose calm recitation of his deepest shame felt like a knife between his ribs. "Who told you that?" Ethan asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "William did," Jeremiah replied, "before he died in my arms, whispering your name and begging forgiveness for the burden he'd placed on you." He spoke of your devotion, your sacrifice, your willingness to bear any sin to spare him pain. The rifle felt impossibly heavy in Ethan's hands. For 8 years, he'd carried the secret of William's death alone. Had built his isolation around the knowledge that he was capable of killing even those he loved most. Now this stranger spoke of it casually, as if it were common knowledge. "What do you want?" Ethan asked finally. Jeremiah's smile returned, warm and understanding. "To give you what you've been seeking all these years. Doctor. Peace. Forgiveness. A chance to save a life instead of taking one." He gestured toward his men, and one of them rode forward. Leading a riderless horse, strapped to its saddle was a long bundle wrapped in canvas, a bundle roughly the size and shape of a human body. "I brought someone to see you," Jeremiah continued conversationally. "Someone who's been asking about his older brother for many years now." With a sick sense of inevitability, Ethan watched as 2 of Jeremiah's men dismounted and began unwrapping the bundle. The canvas fell away to reveal nothing, empty space where Ethan had expected a corpse. "William sends his regards," Jeremiah said, and his smile was no longer warm or grandfatherly. It was the expression of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "He's very much looking forward to your reunion." The world seemed to tilt around Ethan as the implications crashed over him. If the bundle was empty, if this was all some elaborate psychological manipulation, then what had Jeremiah actually come here for? What was the real purpose of this carefully orchestrated revelation? Behind him, Rebecca's small voice cut through his confusion. "He's lying about some things, telling the truth about others. But the man with yellow hair, he's real. He's waiting." Ethan spun to look at the child, but her attention was focused on something beyond the assembled riders. Following her gaze, Ethan saw a lone figure standing at the edge of the tree line. Too distant to make out clearly but unmistakably human in silhouette. "My brother Gabriel will join us when he's ready," Jeremiah said easily. "He's been anticipating this reunion almost as much as I have. You see, Doctor, the path of salvation believes in redemption for even the darkest sins. William has found peace with us, peace he could never find in your world of medicine and rationality." The figure at the tree line began walking toward them, and with each step, Ethan's certainty crumbled further. The height was right, the build, the way the man carried himself. It could be William. After 8 years, it could actually be his brother approaching through the gathering dusk. "This is impossible," Ethan whispered, but even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at him. He'd been so certain of William's death, had built his entire identity around the guilt of that moment. But what if he'd been wrong? What if somehow, impossibly, William had survived? "Nothing is impossible with sufficient faith," Jeremiah replied. "Your brother learned that lesson well. Perhaps it's time you learned it too." The approaching figure was close enough now that Ethan could see his face, and his heart nearly stopped. Older, weathered by years and hardship, but unmistakably the features he remembered. William's eyes, William's mouth, William's gentle smile. "Hello, Ethan," the figure said, and the voice was like a ghost made flesh. "I've missed you, brother." Ethan's rifle slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering on the porch boards. 8 years of guilt, 8 years of carefully constructed isolation, 8 years of believing himself a killer, all of it crumbling in the face of this impossible reunion. "William?" The name was barely a whisper. "But how can you be alive?" William's smile was sad but genuine. "It's a long story, brother. One that begins with your mercy and ends with Jeremiah's grace." Behind Ethan, Rachel's voice cut through the emotional maelstrom. "Don't trust him. This isn't what it seems. Rebecca, show him." But when Ethan turned, he found Rebecca staring at William with an expression of profound confusion. For the first time since he'd met her, the child who saw everything seemed genuinely uncertain. "I can't see him clearly," she whispered, pressing her small hands to her temples. "There's something wrong with the picture. Like looking at 2 people at once." Jeremiah chuckled softly. "The child's gift is remarkable. But even the most talented seers can be overwhelmed by situations beyond their experience." The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. In the gathering shadows, William stepped closer to the porch, and Ethan could see the changes 8 years had wrought. His brother was thinner than he remembered, marked by hardship and suffering. But there was something else, a sense of peace, of certainty that Ethan had never seen in him before. The fever broke me, William said quietly, not just physically, but spiritually. I was ready to die. Ethan, eager for it, even. But Jeremiah found me in that darkness and showed me a different path. I killed you, Ethan said, the words torn from him. I put a gun to your head and... You tried to, William corrected gently, but your hand shook at the last moment. The bullet grazed my skull, left me unconscious but alive. Jeremiah's people found me in the field hospital's morgue, barely breathing but still clinging to life. The explanation was plausible, terrifyingly so. Ethan remembered the chaos of that night, the desperate conditions, the very real possibility that he might have missed his mark in the darkness and confusion. If William had been unconscious, if Jeremiah's people had been watching, waiting. 8 years, Ethan whispered. You let me believe I'd killed you for 8 years. William's expression grew pained. I wanted to contact you, to ease your suffering, but Jeremiah convinced me it was better this way, that you needed to find your own path to redemption. Just as I had found mine. It made a terrible kind of sense. Ethan's isolation, his abandonment of medicine, his carefully constructed exile, all of it built on the foundation of guilt that William's supposed death had created. If Jeremiah had wanted to break him, to make him vulnerable to offers of salvation and forgiveness, keeping William's survival secret would be the perfect strategy. What do you want from me? Ethan asked, though he was beginning to understand the shape of the trap that had been years in the making. Only what we've always wanted, Jeremiah replied, to heal the broken, to offer sanctuary to the lost. You're a doctor, Ethan, surely you understand the value of such work. By taking children from their mothers? By saving a gifted child from a life of fear and confusion. Jeremiah corrected. Rebecca's abilities are remarkable, but without proper guidance, they'll destroy her. She needs teachers who understand her gift. A community that will nurture rather than fear her talents. Ethan looked at Rebecca, still pressed close to Rachel's side, still watching William with that expression of puzzled uncertainty. Whatever she was seeing, it clearly didn't match what Jeremiah wanted her to see. And if I refuse to let them go? Jeremiah's smile never wavered. Then you'll watch history repeat itself. Doctor, another act of violence, another death on your conscience. But this time, you won't have 8 years to learn from your mistakes. The threat was clear, delivered with the same gentle reasonableness that characterized everything about the man. Ethan understood now why Sarah had been drawn to him, why William had found peace in his teachings. Jeremiah offered certainty in a world of chaos, forgiveness for unforgivable sins, answers to questions that had no rational solutions. I need time to think, Ethan said finally. Of course, Jeremiah agreed. Until dawn, shall we say? That gives you the night to consider your options, to speak with your brother, to understand the gift we're offering. He turned his horse, his men following suit with military precision. Only William remained, standing in the growing darkness like a figure from a dream. May I come in? William asked softly. There's so much we need to discuss. Brother, so much I need to explain. Ethan looked at Rachel, saw the fear in her eyes, the protective fury that any threat to her daughter aroused. Then he looked at Rebecca, still clutching her raggedy doll, still watching William with that unsettling focus. What do you see? He asked the child quietly. When you look at him, what do you see? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, her small face scrunched in concentration. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I see 2 men wearing the same face. One who loves you, and one who wants to use that love to hurt you. It wasn't the clear guidance Ethan had hoped for, but it was enough. Whatever stood before him, William, an imposter, or something more complex, it represented a choice between the life he'd built in isolation and a future that Jeremiah Keller wanted to construct for him. Come in, Ethan said finally, stepping aside. But understand, Rachel and Rebecca are under my protection. Whatever you want to discuss. That doesn't change. William's smile was grateful, tinged with what seemed like genuine relief. I wouldn't expect anything less from you, brother. Your protective nature was always your greatest strength. As William stepped onto the porch, Ethan caught a scent that made him pause, not the familiar smell of his brother, but something else. Incense, perhaps. or the lingering traces of candle wax. The smell of places where many people gathered to pray, to seek answers in the darkness. Inside the farmhouse, the three adults arranged themselves around the kitchen table while Rebecca retreated to a corner. Her pencils and papers spread before her like a shield against the complexities of the adult world. But her eyes never left William, tracking his movements with that unnerving intensity. "You look well," William said, studying Ethan's face in the lamplight. "Older, more weathered, but well, the isolation suits you. It's been necessary," Ethan replied carefully. "After what happened, after the choices I made, it seemed best to remove myself from situations where I might cause harm." "Ah, but that's exactly the thinking Jeremiah helped me overcome." William leaned forward, his voice taking on the cadence of someone accustomed to teaching, to explaining complex spiritual concepts to those still struggling in darkness. "You see the killing as a sin, as evidence of your unworthiness to heal. But what if it was actually a moment of grace? What if your willingness to bear that burden was exactly what qualified you to understand true mercy?" The words were seductive in their logic, offering a framework where Ethan's greatest shame became evidence of his spiritual superiority. It was exactly the kind of reasoning that had drawn Sarah away from medicine and into Jeremiah's web of false promises. "And what does Jeremiah's version of mercy require?" Ethan asked. "Service," William replied simply. "The use of your medical skills in service of a higher purpose." The path has communities throughout the Western Territories. Doctor. People who need healing, who have been failed by conventional medicine just as conventional medicine failed to understand your brother's true condition. "My medical skills killed my brother and couldn't save my wife," Ethan said flatly. "What makes you think they're worth anything now?" "Because failure teaches us humility," William explained patiently. "Because suffering opens our hearts to truths we couldn't see before. Jeremiah believes, and I've come to agree, that doctors who have experienced real loss, real failure, are the only ones capable of practicing true healing." Across the table, Rachel made a soft sound of disgust. "Beautiful words," she said acidly, "but I've seen Jeremiah's version of healing. I've watched him cure people by convincing them their suffering was a spiritual test. That accepting pain without question was the path to salvation." William's expression grew pained. "You misunderstand the path's teachings." "Rachel, yes, there are trials, moments when faith is tested. But the goal is always genuine healing. Genuine peace. Like the peace you found after 8 years of letting your brother believe he'd murdered you?" Rachel's voice was sharp with anger. "That kind of peace?" For just a moment, something flickered across William's face, uncertainty. Perhaps, or the shadow of an old guilt. But then the serene confidence returned, and he shook his head sadly. "I know how it must seem," he said, "but Jeremiah convinced me that Ethan needed to walk his own path to redemption. That my premature revelation would only rob him of the growth that comes from confronting our deepest shames. It was a masterful justification, transforming abandonment into spiritual guidance, cruelty into compassion." Ethan recognized the sophisticated manipulation at work. The way Jeremiah's teachings could make any action seem righteous if viewed through the proper theological lens. "And Rebecca?" Ethan asked. "What path to redemption does Jeremiah have planned for a 7-year-old child?" William's gaze moved to the corner where Rebecca sat drawing, her small hands moving with swift, sure strokes across the paper. "She's gifted, Ethan, truly gifted, but such abilities without proper guidance become a curse rather than a blessing. Jeremiah has experience with seers, with those who can perceive beyond the veil of ordinary reality." "What kind of experience?" Before William could answer, Rebecca looked up from her drawing and fixed him with those penetrating eyes. "You're not lying," she said quietly, "but you're not telling the whole truth either. There's something you're not allowed to say." The room went silent. William stared at the child with an expression of surprise and something that might have been fear. "Rebecca," Rachel warned softly, "come away from there." But the child ignored her mother, rising and walking slowly toward William. "You love him," she said, nodding toward Ethan. "That part is real. But the rest is like a song someone else is making you sing." William's face had gone pale. "I don't know what you mean, child." "Yes, you do." Rebecca reached into her pocket and withdrew a small piece of paper. Placing it on the table between them, The drawing showed two men, one kneeling before the other. The kneeling figure wore a collar around his neck, and the standing figure held what appeared to be a key. Some people are trapped in chains, Rebecca said softly, but some people are trapped in promises. Which kind of trap are you in? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Ethan studied his brother's face, noting the tension around his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. William, Ethan said quietly, are you here of your own free will? Of course I am, William replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Jeremiah doesn't force anyone to serve the path. Everything we do from genuine belief in. In what? Ethan pressed. In a man who preys on grief and guilt, who collects broken people and uses their suffering as leverage to control them. You don't understand, William said desperately. Jeremiah saved me, when I was dying, when the fever had broken my mind. He was the only one who saw value in preserving my life. He could have let me die, could have let your mercy killing succeed. Instead, he chose to invest years of care, of teaching, of creating a debt you could never repay. Rachel finished grimly. That's how he operates. William, he saves people just enough to make them feel obligated, then spends the rest of their lives collecting on that debt. William's composure was cracking now, the serene confidence giving way to something more fragile and desperate. You're wrong. You don't know him like I do. You haven't seen the good he does. The people he's helped. The people he's killed. Rachel corrected. My husband died in one of Jeremiah's purification rituals. Burned alive while Jeremiah's followers watched and called it a blessed ascension. The words hit William like a physical blow. He staggered back from the table, one hand pressed to his chest as if struggling to breathe. That's not. Daniel chose that path. He volunteered for purification because he believed. Because Jeremiah convinced him that his doubts were sins that could only be cleansed through fire. Rachel said relentlessly, just like he's convinced you that your survival is a debt rather than a gift. Ethan watched his brother's face cycle through emotions, denial, anger, fear, and beneath it all, a growing recognition of truths he'd spent 8 years avoiding. When William finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. What if you're right? He asked. What if everything I've believed, everything I've done in service to the path, what if it's all been a lie? Then you start over, Ethan said simply. You make different choices, beginning now. William laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You make it sound so simple. But I've done things, Ethan, terrible things in the name of spiritual purification. People have died because I believed Jeremiah's promises about redemption through suffering. Then stop believing them, Rachel said. Help us stop him. I can't. The words were torn from William's throat. Even if I wanted to, I can't. He has. There are things you don't understand about how the path operates. Leaving isn't just a matter of walking away. Rebecca had been listening to this exchange with growing intensity, her small face scrunched in concentration. Now she approached William again, reaching out to touch his hand, the key around his neck. She said suddenly, looking at Ethan, it's not what you think it is. Show him, Uncle William, show him what you're really wearing. William recoiled as if her touch had burned him. I don't know what you mean. But Rebecca's gaze had turned inward. That expression of supernatural focus that preceded her most accurate visions. It's not gold like yours, she said to Ethan. It's silver. And it's not a key to a box, it's a key to a cage. A cage he carries with him wherever he goes. With shaking hands, William reached for the leather cord around his neck and pulled it free from beneath his shirt. What emerged wasn't a brass key like Ethan's, but a small silver pendant shaped like a house, or perhaps a prison cell. Every member of the inner circle wears one, William said quietly, a reminder that we belong to the path, that our lives are no longer our own. It's blessed, Jeremiah says, a symbol of our dedication. It's a collar, Rachel said with disgust, a way to mark his property. William's laugh was bitter now, tinged with years of suppressed recognition. Yes, I suppose it is. The admission seemed to break something in him. He slumped in his chair, the confident preacher's demeanor crumbling to reveal the broken man beneath. I remember wanting to contact you, he said to Ethan, especially in the early years, when the nightmares were still fresh. But every time I tried to leave, every time I questioned Jeremiah's wisdom, he would remind me of his investment in my survival, of how ungrateful it would be to abandon the man who had saved me from certain death. Gratitude isn't slavery, Ethan said firmly. Isn't it? William looked up at him with haunted eyes. When someone holds your very existence in their hands, when they've shaped every aspect of your reality for 8 years, how do you tell the difference between voluntary service and elaborate capped? Retry. JN. Continue. Edit. Ivati? It was a question that cut to the heart of Jeremiah's power, his ability to blur the lines between salvation and manipulation, between spiritual guidance and psychological control. Ethan began to understand how his brother had been trapped, not by chains or threats, but by a web of obligation and manufactured guilt that made escape seem not just impossible but morally wrong. Rebecca, Ethan said suddenly, an idea forming. Can you see what happens if William tries to leave? If he refuses to go back to Jeremiah? The child closed her eyes. Her small hands pressed to her temples in that familiar gesture of concentration. When she opened them, her expression was troubled. Fire, she said simply, not for him, but for others. Jeremiah burns things when he's angry. Places where people used to live. The threat was clear: if William defected, Jeremiah would take his anger out on innocent people. The path had communities throughout the territory, followers who trusted in their leader's wisdom. How many would suffer if William's rebellion triggered one of Jeremiah's purifications? He's thought of everything, William said quietly, recognizing the trap that Rebecca had revealed. Even if I wanted to escape, even if I found the courage to try, the cost would be too high. But Ethan was studying Rebecca's drawing again, noting details he'd missed before. The figure with the key wasn't alone, there were others around him. Faces unclear but bodies turned toward the central figure in postures of support. What if you didn't escape alone? He asked. What if there were others who wanted to leave the path? Others who were willing to stand together against Jeremiah's threats? William's eyes widened with something that might have been hope. There are some doubters. People who've grown uncomfortable with the direction of Jeremiah's teachings. But they're scattered, isolated. Most are too afraid to voice their concerns openly, because they think they're alone. Rachel added, understanding dawning in her voice. Because Jeremiah's made each of them believe their doubts are unique. Personal failures rather than reasonable responses to his manipulation. If they knew others shared their concerns, Ethan continued, if they understood they weren't alone in questioning Jeremiah's authority, it could work. William breathed. There's a gathering planned for tomorrow night, a purification ceremony for new initiates. Most of the path's leadership will be there, along with community members from across the territory. Including the doubters you mentioned? Yes. It would be the perfect opportunity to. William trailed off. The magnitude of what they were considering settling over him. But the risks. Ethan, if we're wrong about the others, if they report our plans to Jeremiah, he'll move against us immediately. And if we do nothing, Rachel pointed out, he'll continue destroying lives one person at a time. How many more Daniels will die while we hesitate to act? The question hung in the air as the three adults contemplated the choice before them. Outside, night had fully fallen, and somewhere in the darkness, Jeremiah Keller waited for an answer to his ultimatum. By dawn, Ethan would have to choose, surrender Rachel and Rebecca to the path's tender mercies, or find a way to strike at the heart of Jeremiah's power. Rebecca had returned to her corner and her drawings, but now she looked up with that uncanny perception that seemed to cut through all pretense and uncertainty. The fire is coming either way, she said quietly, but if you're brave enough to light it yourselves, you get to choose what burns. The child's words crystallized everything. The choice wasn't between safety and danger, but between different kinds of destruction. They could surrender to Jeremiah's will and watch him continue his methodical dismantling of human dignity. Or they could take the risk of fighting back and hope that what rose from the ashes would be worth the cost. Ethan looked at his brother, saw the years of manipulation and manufactured guilt written in the lines around his eyes. Then he looked at Rachel, saw the fierce protectiveness that had driven her to risk everything for her daughter's freedom. Finally, he looked at Rebecca, the child whose visions had brought them all together and whose future hung in the balance. All right, he said finally, tell me about this gathering. Tell me how we tear down everything Jeremiah Keller has built." For the first time in 8 years, William Blackwood smiled with something approaching genuine joy. "It begins," he said, "with teaching his followers to see him as he really is." As the three adults bent over William's rough map of the path's compound, planning their desperate gambit, Rebecca added one final figure to her latest drawing, a small girl with dark hair, standing safely behind a group of adults who faced a burning building with their backs straight and their hands joined. The fire was coming, indeed, but for the first time in years, they would be the ones holding the matches. Dawn came reluctantly to the Montana plains, as if even the sun hesitated to illuminate what the new day would bring. Ethan stood at his kitchen window, watching the first pale light creep across the landscape while behind him, the others prepared for what might be their last day of freedom. William had spent most of the night drawing maps and diagrams, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what they planned. The path's compound lay 15 miles north, nestled in a valley that provided both natural protection and symbolic isolation from the corrupted world beyond. Tomorrow night's gathering would bring together nearly 200 followers from across the territory, the largest assembly Jeremiah had called in years. "The purification ceremony is scheduled for midnight," William explained, his finger tracing routes on the hand-drawn map. "New initiates will be brought forward to demonstrate their faith through trials of fire and water. But before that, there's always a period of testimony, confession of doubts, public affirmation of belief." "And that's when the doubters reveal themselves?" Rachel asked. "Usually through their silence," William confirmed. "Jeremiah has a gift for reading people, for identifying those whose faith wavers. He'll call on specific individuals, pressure them to speak their loyalty aloud. Those who hesitate, who struggle to find the words, become targets for special attention." Ethan finished grimly. "Or examples for the others," William said. "Jeremiah's purifications aren't always reserved for volunteers." The implications hung heavy in the morning air. They weren't just planning to expose Jeremiah's manipulation, they were racing against time to prevent him from making examples of those whose faith had begun to crack. Rebecca sat at the table, working on a new series of drawings with intense concentration. Unlike her previous visions of past and present, these images seemed to show possible futures, branching paths that shifted and changed each time Ethan looked at them. "What do you see, sweetheart?" Rachel asked, settling beside her daughter. "Different endings," Rebecca replied without looking up. "Some with fire, some with water, some where people run away, some where they stand and fight." She paused, adding careful details to one particular image. "This one happens if Uncle William is brave enough to tell the truth." The drawing showed a man standing before a crowd, his arms outstretched as if embracing or protecting them. Around him, other figures turned away from a distant building that blazed with unnatural light. "And this one," Rebecca continued, pointing to another image, "happens if the silver man gets angry too fast." This drawing was darker, more chaotic, the same crowd, but scattered and running, with flames consuming not just buildings but people. In the center, a tall figure with silver hair raised his arms toward a sky full of smoke. "We have to warn them carefully," William said, studying the images. "If Jeremiah suspects what we're planning, if he feels cornered, he'll accelerate the purification." Ethan understood. "Force a crisis before we can organize any real resistance." "Exactly. Which means we need to move today, identify the potential allies, plant seeds of doubt about Jeremiah's true nature, but do it subtly enough that he doesn't realize what's happening until it's too late." The plan they developed was dangerous in its simplicity. William would return to the compound as expected, but instead of reporting Ethan's location, he would begin quietly reaching out to those he knew harbored doubts about Jeremiah's methods. Meanwhile, Ethan and Rachel would approach the gathering from the outside, using the chaos of the ceremony to position themselves where they could provide evidence of Jeremiah's crimes when the moment came. "There's something else," William said reluctantly. "Something I haven't told you about tomorrow night's ceremony." Ethan looked up from the map, noting the tension in his brother's posture. "What?" "The new initiates aren't volunteers," William said quietly. "They're children, orphans that Jeremiah has collected over the past year. The youngest is 6 years old. Rachel's face went white. He's going to put children through purification trials? Not trials, William corrected, his voice thick with shame. Selections. He's choosing which children show the most potential for his purposes. Which ones will be taken into the inner circle for special training. Training for what? William's gaze moved to Rebecca, and understanding dawned with sickening clarity. To be like her. Jeremiah believes that certain children, properly guided, can develop supernatural abilities. He's been experimenting with techniques to enhance their natural sensitivity. You mean torture, Rachel said flatly. He calls it spiritual refinement. William replied, controlled trauma that breaks down the barriers between the physical and spiritual worlds. Most of the children don't survive the process. But those who do, become weapons. Ethan finished. Tools for Jeremiah to use in expanding his influence. The revelation transformed their mission from a rescue operation into something far more urgent. They weren't just trying to expose Jeremiah's past crimes, they were racing to prevent him from creating a new generation of victims. How many children? Rachel asked. 12 this time, William said, though not all of them will be selected. Jeremiah usually chooses 2 or 3 from each group. Sends the others to work in the agricultural communes. Still slaves, Ethan observed, just different kinds of exploitation. William nodded miserably. I've tried to intervene before. To suggest alternative approaches, but Jeremiah views any questioning of his methods as evidence of spiritual weakness. Those who object too strenuously tend to find themselves volunteered for purification ceremonies. The morning light had grown stronger while they talked. And now Ethan could see movement in the distance, riders approaching from the direction of town. Not Jeremiah's men this time, but a single figure on horseback moving with urgent purpose. Someone's coming, he announced, reaching for his rifle. William joined him at the window, squinting into the distance. It's Sheriff Grimes, he said with surprise. What's he doing here? Probably looking for you, Rachel said grimly, or for us. But as the sheriff approached, his body language suggested urgency rather than aggression. He dismounted quickly, leaving his horse to graze while he strode toward the farmhouse with obvious purpose. Ethan opened the door before Grimes could knock. Sheriff, early for a social call. This isn't social, Doc, Grimes replied tersely. We need to talk, all of us. He stepped inside without invitation, his gaze moving quickly from Ethan to Rachel to William. When his eyes settled on Rebecca, sitting quietly at her table full of drawings, his expression softened slightly. Miss Rebecca, he said gently, I'm Walter Grimes. I'm a friend. Rebecca studied him with that penetrating gaze, then nodded slowly. You lost someone too, she said, a girl with yellow hair. Grimes flinched as if she'd struck him. Emily, my daughter. How did you? I see things sometimes, Rebecca replied simply. She's not dead, but she's not alive either. She's sleeping in a place where they keep the broken dolls. The sheriff's face went ashen. What does that mean? What place? But Rebecca had already turned back to her drawings, apparently finished with the conversation. Grimes looked desperately at the adults, seeking explanation for the child's cryptic words. Jeremiah has a facility, William said reluctantly, in the mountains, about 50 miles from the main compound. He calls it the sanctuary. It's where he keeps the children who don't survive the spiritual refinement process. Alive but damaged beyond recovery, Rachel added with disgust. Too broken to function normally, but too valuable to Jeremiah to simply dispose of. My Emily is there? Grimes asked, his voice barely above a whisper. If she's anywhere, William confirmed. The sanctuary is where Jeremiah houses his mistakes. Grimes was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 3 years' worth of futile searching. I came here to warn you, he said. Jeremiah's moved up his timeline. The ceremony isn't tomorrow night, it's tonight. And he's not just planning to select new children for training. What do you mean? Ethan asked, though he suspected he already knew. He's planning something he calls the Great Purification. Grimes continued, according to my sources in the path. He believes the time has come to cleanse the entire territory of unbelievers, starting with anyone who's shown sympathy for his enemies. The words hit like a physical blow. If Jeremiah was accelerating his plans, if he intended to move against not just Rebecca but all potential opposition. "How many people are we talking about?" Rachel asked. "Hundreds," Grimes replied grimly. "He's identified families throughout the territory, people who've questioned his authority, refused to join the path, or simply been deemed spiritually unworthy. Tonight's ceremony is meant to be the signal for coordinated attacks. A religious war," Ethan said slowly. "He's trying to start a religious war, and position himself as the only salvation when the smoke clears." William added, "It's brilliant. In a horrifying way. Create enough chaos and fear. Eliminate enough opposition, and people will accept any authority that promises stability." Rebecca looked up from her drawings, her small face grave. "The fire dreams were about this," she said. "Not just buildings burning, everything burning. People, places, all the things that make it safe to be different." The magnitude of Jeremiah's plan was staggering. They'd been thinking in terms of exposing one man's crimes, but he was orchestrating something far larger, a systematic purge that would reshape the entire Montana territory according to his vision. "We can't fight that," Rachel said. "Not with the four of us and whatever allies William might recruit." 5. Grimes corrected. "I'm with you, whatever you're planning." 6. Said a new voice from the doorway. They turned to see a woman standing in the entrance, middle-aged, weathered by frontier life, but carrying herself with quiet authority. Ethan recognized her vaguely from his infrequent trips to town, though he couldn't place her name. "Mrs. Henderson," Grimes said with surprise. "What are you doing here?" "Same thing you are, Walter," she replied, stepping inside. "Trying to stop a madman before he destroys everything decent folks have built in this territory." She nodded to the others, her gaze lingering on William with obvious recognition. "Gabriel, isn't it? Or should I say William Blackwood?" William went pale. "How do you know that name?" "Because I knew your parents," Mrs. Henderson replied. "Helped your mother birth both you boys. As a matter of fact, been watching from a distance ever since. Wondering when you'd find the courage to remember who you really were." The revelation added another layer of complexity to an already tangled situation. How many people in the territory knew more about the Blackwood family's history than Ethan had realized? How many had been watching, waiting for this confrontation? "Mrs. Henderson runs the telegraph office," Grimes explained. "She's been monitoring Jeremiah's communications for months, building a network of people who share our concerns." "How many?" Ethan asked. "More than you might think," Mrs. Henderson replied. "Jeremiah's made a lot of enemies over the years, people who've lost family members to his purifications, business owners who've been forced to pay tribute to the path, families who've had children recruited against their will." She pulled a folded paper from her coat pocket, spreading it on the table beside Rebecca's drawings. It was a list of names, dozens of them, organized by location throughout the territory. "These are confirmed allies," she said, "people who've agreed to act when the time comes. We've been waiting for the right moment, the right catalyst to bring them together." "And you think tonight is that moment?" Rachel asked. "I think tonight is our only chance," Mrs. Henderson replied. "If Jeremiah succeeds with his great purification, if he eliminates enough opposition to consolidate power, we'll never get another opportunity like this." William studied the list, recognizing many of the names. "These people, Jeremiah trusts some of them. They're members of the path. Some even hold positions of authority. Double agents," Grimes confirmed. "People who joined to gather intelligence, or who had genuine faith initially but became disillusioned with Jeremiah's methods." "Like you did," Ethan said to his brother. William nodded slowly. "But if we move against him tonight, during the ceremony, it won't just be a few dissidents making accusations. It'll be a coordinated challenge to his authority from within his own organization." "Exactly," Mrs. Henderson said. "We expose him when he's most vulnerable, surrounded by his followers but also by people who finally found the courage to stand up to him." The plan was taking shape now, more complex and ambitious than anything they'd originally envisioned. Instead of a desperate attempt to rescue Rebecca and escape, they were organizing a full-scale rebellion against Jeremiah's authority. "What about the children?" Rachel asked. "The ones he's planning to experiment on tonight?" "That's where you come in," Mrs. Henderson said. "While the adults create chaos in the main ceremony area, Someone needs to get to the children and lead them to safety. I'll do it, Ethan said immediately. No, William interrupted. You need to be in the ceremony area, providing medical evidence of Jeremiah's crimes. I know where the children are kept. Know the layout of the compound. I should be the one to get them out. It's too dangerous, Ethan protested. If Jeremiah realizes you've betrayed him, then I'll die for something worthwhile instead of living for something evil. William replied firmly. This is my chance to finally make amends for 8 years of complicity. Rebecca looked up from her drawings, studying William's face with that uncanny perception. You won't die, she said quietly, but you'll have to choose between saving the children and saving yourself. And you'll choose right. The simple statement carried more weight than any oath or promise. Whatever Rebecca saw in her visions, whatever futures she could perceive, she believed William would find the courage to act when the moment came. All right, Ethan said finally, but we do this together. No one acts alone. No one makes sacrifices without the others knowing. Agreed, Mrs. Henderson said. The attack begins at sunset, coordinated strikes against path facilities throughout the territory. But the main event happens at the compound during the ceremony. What's our signal? Grimes asked. Rebecca held up her latest drawing, a church bell tower with flames erupting from its base. When the bell stops ringing, she said, that's when everything changes. As the adults finalized their plans, Ethan found himself studying his brother's face, noting the changes that 8 years of spiritual captivity had wrought. The old William had been gentle, idealistic, perhaps too trusting for his own good. This version was harder, marked by compromise and complicity. But underneath it all, Ethan could see traces of the boy who had once followed him everywhere. Believing his older brother could fix any problem. I'm sorry, William said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. For letting you carry the guilt all these years. For choosing Jeremiah's version of salvation over the truth. We all made choices we regret. Ethan replied. The question is what we do about them now. Now we make different choices. Rachel said firmly. We choose to fight instead of hiding. We choose to protect children instead of using them. We choose truth instead of convenient lies. Mrs. Henderson was gathering her papers, preparing to leave and coordinate with the other rebels throughout the territory. Remember, she said, tonight we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for everyone Jeremiah has hurt, everyone he plans to hurt, and everyone who deserves to live free from his version of salvation. As the sheriff and Mrs. Henderson departed to make their preparations, the 4 remaining in the farmhouse settled into an uneasy quiet. The plan was set. The allies identified. The stakes clear. Now came the hardest part, waiting for sunset and the moment when words would give way to action. Rebecca had abandoned her drawings in favor of sitting by the window, watching the sky as if she could will the sun to move faster across its arc. Are you scared? She asked suddenly. The question directed at no one in particular. Yes, Rachel replied honestly, but sometimes being scared is what tells you something's worth fighting for. I'm scared too, William admitted, but for the first time in 8 years. I'm more afraid of doing nothing than I am of taking action. Ethan looked at the 3 people who had somehow become his family in the space of 2 days, the brother he'd thought dead, the woman who'd brought purpose back to his life, and the child whose visions had forced them all to confront uncomfortable truths. The old Ethan would have run, he said quietly, would have taken you as far from here as possible and hoped someone else would solve the problem. And now? Rachel asked. Now I understand that some problems follow you no matter how far you run. Ethan replied. Jeremiah's influence will keep spreading, keep destroying lives, until someone finds the courage to stop him. Then we stop him, William said with growing conviction. We stop him tonight. As afternoon faded toward evening, they made their final preparations. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, maps memorized, contingencies planned for a dozen different scenarios. But beneath the practical preparations lay something more fundamental, a shared understanding that they were about to cross a line from which there would be no retreat. The old lives they'd known, the careful isolation Ethan had built, the spiritual captivity William had endured, Rachel's desperate flight from her past, all of it was ending tonight. What would replace it remained unknown. But anything had to be better than allowing Jeremiah's darkness to continue spreading across the territory. as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire. Rebecca made one final drawing. This one showed 4 figures standing together before a great burning building. Their backs straight and their hands joined. Above them, the sky was full of stars, not the smoke and chaos of her earlier visions, but the clear, clean light of hope. "We're ready," she announced, setting down her pencil with finality. And for the first time in years, Ethan Blackwood believed she was right. The Path of Salvation's compound sprawled across the valley floor like a small city dedicated to singular purpose. From their position on the overlooking ridge, Ethan could see dozens of buildings arranged around a central meeting hall, with smaller structures radiating outward in concentric circles. Torches and lanterns illuminated pathways between the buildings, and everywhere, people moved with the purposeful urgency of those preparing for a momentous event. 237 souls, William murmured beside him, his voice heavy with knowledge of what many of those souls would face before dawn. Jeremiah's been gathering followers for weeks, promising them a revelation that would transform their understanding of divine purpose. "The Great Purification," Rachel said grimly, adjusting her grip on the rifle she carried. "How many of them know what he's really planning?" "The inner circle knows," William replied. "Perhaps 24 men who've proven their absolute loyalty through years of service. The rest, they believe they're attending a celebration of faith." From their vantage point, Ethan could see the careful choreography of Jeremiah's event. Guards were positioned at key points throughout the compound, but they faced outward, watching for external threats rather than monitoring the gathering faithful. It was the confidence of a man who believed his control was absolute, his authority unquestionable. That arrogance would be his downfall. The children's dormitory, William pointed to a long, low building near the compound's eastern edge. 12 children, ages 6 to 14, guarded by 2 men who believe they're protecting precious resources rather than preventing escapes. "And the ceremony?" Ethan asked. "Main hall, center of the compound. Jeremiah will begin with testimonials from new converts, then move to the purification trials. The children will be brought forward around midnight, after the adult audience has been properly prepared." Ethan understood. Jeremiah would work his crowd into a state of religious fervor before introducing the most horrific elements of his plan. By midnight, the assembled faithful would be ready to accept any atrocity as divine will, unless they intervened first. "Mrs. Henderson's people are in position?" Rachel asked. William nodded, pointing to various locations throughout the compound. 17 confirmed allies scattered among the crowd, each responsible for rallying specific groups when the signal comes. They've been building networks of sympathizers for months. People who joined the path seeking genuine spiritual community but became uncomfortable with Jeremiah's increasingly extreme demands. "And Sheriff Grimes?" "Positioned near the main hall with federal backup," William confirmed. "The moment we provide concrete evidence of Jeremiah's crimes, they'll move to arrest him and his inner circle." The plan was complex, requiring precise timing and considerable faith in people they barely knew. But as Ethan surveyed the compound below, he understood they had no choice but to trust in the network Mrs. Henderson had built. The alternative, allowing Jeremiah's great purification to proceed, was unthinkable. "Rebecca," he said quietly, turning to the child who sat beside them on the rocky outcrop. "What do you see when you look at the compound? What's waiting for us down there?" Rebecca closed her eyes, that familiar expression of inward focus crossing her small features. When she opened them again, her gaze was troubled but determined. "2 paths," she said finally. "One where we're too late, where the Silver Man's anger burns everything and everyone runs away in the dark. And one where—" She paused, struggling to articulate something beyond her years. "Where what, sweetheart?" Rachel prompted gently. "Where the truth is louder than the lies," Rebecca finished. "Where people remember they can choose different things than fear." It wasn't the clear prophecy Ethan had hoped for, but it was enough. They had a chance, perhaps their only chance, to break Jeremiah's hold on his followers before his planned purification could begin. "Time to move," William said, checking his pocket watch. "The ceremony begins in 30 minutes. They made their way down the ridge in careful silence, following game trails that William had scouted during his years with the path. As they approached the compound's perimeter, The sounds of the gathering grew clearer, hymns sung with passionate fervor. The low rumble of crowd voices. And underneath it all, the authoritative cadence of Jeremiah's voice as he addressed his followers. At the eastern edge of the compound, they split up according to plan. William would approach the children's dormitory from the rear, using his knowledge of the building's layout and the guards' routines to extract the 12 young prisoners. Ethan, Rachel, and Rebecca would circle to the main hall, where they would wait for Mrs. Henderson's signal before revealing the evidence that would hopefully turn Jeremiah's own followers against him. "Be careful," Ethan told his brother as they prepared to separate. "If something goes wrong, if you're discovered, then I'll buy you as much time as possible." William replied firmly, "But it won't come to that. For the first time in 8 years, I know exactly what I'm supposed to do." They embraced briefly, and Ethan was surprised by how solid William felt. How real after years of believing him dead. Whatever happened tonight, at least they'd had this, a chance to reconcile. To stand together against the darkness that had shaped both their lives. "Go," William said, and melted into the shadows with the practiced stealth of someone who'd spent years moving unseen through hostile territory. Ethan led Rachel and Rebecca around the compound's perimeter, staying well clear of the torch-lit pathways where late arrivals still streamed toward the main hall. As they moved, he could hear fragments of Jeremiah's address carrying on the night air. "Chosen generation, called to purify this land of corruption and false doctrine. Those who resist God's will shall be swept away like chaff before the wind. Tonight marks the beginning of a new age. An age of righteousness." The words were crafted to inspire and terrify in equal measure, promising glorious purpose to the faithful while threatening divine wrath for any who dared oppose. It was masterful manipulation, Ethan realized, the same techniques Jeremiah had used to ensnare William. To influence Sarah, to build a following of people desperate enough to accept any authority that offered meaning in their suffering. They reached their position behind the main hall just as Jeremiah's voice rose to a crescendo. "Bring forward the witnesses. Let all hear how the Lord has blessed those who embrace his holy purpose." Through a gap in the building's rear wall, Ethan could see the ceremony unfolding. The hall was packed with people, men, women, families who'd traveled from across the territory to participate in what they believed would be a celebration of their faith. At the front, on a raised platform decorated with religious symbols, Jeremiah Keller commanded attention with the magnetic presence that had drawn so many into his web. He was exactly as Ethan remembered from their brief encounter, silver-haired, distinguished, radiating the kind of charismatic authority that made people want to believe whatever he told them. But now, seeing him in his element, Ethan understood the full scope of the man's power. This wasn't just a cult leader addressing his followers. This was a would-be prophet claiming divine authority over hundreds of souls. "Sister Margaret," Jeremiah called out, and a middle-aged woman came forward from the crowd. "Tell your brothers and sisters how the path has transformed your life." The woman's testimony was heartfelt, emotional, a widow who'd found community and purpose after losing her husband to a mining accident. Her gratitude to Jeremiah was genuine, her faith in his teachings absolute. Listening to her speak, Ethan could understand how even rational people might be drawn into the path's embrace. But he also noticed the subtle manipulation in Jeremiah's responses, how he redirected her gratitude from the community to himself personally. How he framed her husband's death as part of a divine plan that only he could interpret. Each testimony became another thread in the web of dependency he wove around his followers. And now, Jeremiah announced as Sister Margaret returned to the crowd, "Let us hear from one who has walked farthest from the light, yet found his way back to grace through divine mercy." Ethan's blood chilled as he realized who Jeremiah was calling forward. A figure emerged from the shadows at the side of the platform, tall, thin, moving with the careful dignity of someone who'd endured years of spiritual captivity. Gabriel, the man Jeremiah's followers knew as his most devoted disciple, his right hand in all matters of faith and discipline. But Ethan saw through the carefully constructed persona to the broken man beneath, his brother William, about to face the ultimate test of his newfound courage. "Gabriel," Jeremiah said warmly, placing a paternal hand on William's shoulder as he took the platform. "Share with us the joy of your redemption." Tell them how divine grace can transform even the most stubborn heart." William stood before the assembled crowd, his face pale but resolute in the torchlight. For a moment, he was silent, and Ethan could see the struggle playing out behind his eyes, 8 years of conditioning warring with newly awakened conscience. When William finally spoke, his voice carried clearly through the hall. "My name is William Blackwood." The simple declaration sent a ripple of confusion through the crowd. They knew him as Gabriel, Jeremiah's adopted spiritual son. The use of his birth name suggested something far more significant than the typical testimony they'd been expecting. Jeremiah's expression remained carefully controlled, but Ethan caught a flash of concern in his eyes. "Brother Gabriel," he said smoothly, "surely you meant to say—" "I meant to say William Blackwood." William interrupted, his voice growing stronger. "Son of Thomas and Mary Blackwood. Brother to Dr. Ethan Blackwood, and for 8 years. A man who lost himself so completely that he forgot his own name." Now murmurs of confusion were spreading through the crowd. This wasn't the testimony they'd been prepared for. Wasn't following the script of grateful conversion and absolute submission that characterized path gatherings. "I stand before you tonight," William continued, "to confess not my gratitude for Jeremiah Keller's guidance, but my shame at having followed him for so long without questioning the cost of his version of salvation." Jeremiah stepped forward, his paternal mask slipping slightly. "Brother, you're clearly overwrought. Perhaps it would be better if I continued to lie?" William's voice cut through the hall like a blade. "If I continued to help you manipulate grief and fear into weapons against innocent people? If I continued to stand silent while you destroyed families in the name of divine purpose?" The crowd was growing restless now, sensing that something unprecedented was happening. Some followers looked confused, others concerned, but Ethan could see pockets of people, Mrs. Henderson's allies, watching William with intense focus, waiting for their cue to act. "The path of salvation," William announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "is built on lies. Jeremiah Keller is not a prophet, not a divine messenger, not even a man of genuine faith. He is a predator who feeds on human suffering, who creates the very desperation he claims to cure. Seize him," Jeremiah commanded, his careful composure finally cracking. "This man has been corrupted by outside influences. He speaks blasphemy." But as members of the inner circle moved toward the platform, something extraordinary happened. Throughout the crowd, people began standing, not to support Jeremiah's order, but to face him with expressions of long-suppressed doubt and growing anger. "I want to know about my daughter," a man near the front shouted. "Emily Grimes, where is she? And my son?" Another voice called out. "Michael disappeared after questioning your teachings. What happened to him?" Retry. JN. Continue. Edit. Quote. "Show us the sanctuary," a woman demanded. "Show us where you keep the children who don't survive your spiritual refinement." The hall erupted into chaos as months of carefully suppressed questions finally found their voice. Mrs. Henderson's network had done its work well. Scattered throughout the crowd were people who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. This permission to speak truths they'd been afraid to voice alone. Jeremiah raised his hands, trying to restore order through the force of his personality. "My children, you're being deceived. This is exactly the kind of spiritual attack the scriptures warned us about. Stand firm in your faith." But his words were lost in the growing tumult. Near the platform, his inner circle was struggling to maintain control as more and more followers joined the uprising. Some remained loyal to Jeremiah, confused and frightened by the sudden chaos. But others were finally seeing their leader's true nature exposed. Through the rear wall, Ethan watched the scene unfold with a mixture of hope and terror. William had done his part magnificently, but now came the most dangerous moment when Jeremiah, cornered and desperate, would likely resort to the violence that had always lurked beneath his religious facade. "Now," Ethan whispered to Rachel and Rebecca, "we go now." While his attention is focused on the crowd, they slipped around to the main entrance of the hall, joining the stream of confused followers who were trying to understand what was happening inside. In the chaos, 3 more people entering went unnoticed, just part of the crowd drawn by the commotion. Once inside, Ethan could see the full scope of the confrontation. William stood alone at the center of the platform, facing down not just Jeremiah but the full weight of a belief system he'd helped maintain for 8 years. Around him, the crowd had divided into roughly equal camps, those defending their leader and those finally finding courage to question his authority. "Where are the children?" Sheriff Grimes called out, pushing through the crowd toward the platform. Behind him came 2 men Ethan didn't recognize, but whose bearing suggested federal authority. "Where are the 12 children you've taken for tonight's ceremony?" Jeremiah's eyes blazed with fury as he realized the scope of the challenge he faced. This wasn't just one broken disciple speaking out, it was a coordinated assault on everything he'd built. "The children are safe," he replied coldly, "protected from corruption by those who would poison their minds against divine truth." "Bring them here," Grimes demanded. "Now. Let their families see them. Speak with them. The children have no families but the path," Jeremiah declared. "They have been chosen for a higher purpose, cleansed of worldly attachments that would hinder their spiritual development." It was exactly the wrong thing to say. Parents throughout the crowd who'd been wavering in their allegiance suddenly understood what Jeremiah's higher purpose meant for their own children. The angry murmurs grew louder, more threatening. "Dr. Blackwood," William called out suddenly, his eyes finding Ethan in the crowd. Tell them what you know about the path's version of healing." This was the moment they'd planned for, Ethan's medical expertise providing concrete evidence of Jeremiah's crimes. He pushed forward through the crowd, ignoring the hostile stares of Jeremiah's loyal followers. "My name is Dr. Ethan Blackwood," he announced as he reached the front of the hall. "I've treated victims of the path's purification rituals. I've seen what Jeremiah Keller calls divine healing." He pulled out the photographs Mrs. Henderson had provided, images of burn victims, of children who'd survived the path's spiritual refinement only to be left permanently damaged. The evidence was graphic, undeniable, horrifying in its clinical detail. "This is what purification through fire looks like," Ethan said, holding up the first photograph. "Third-degree burns covering 60% of the body. This child was 7 years old when Jeremiah decided he needed cleansing." Gasps and cries of horror rippled through the crowd as they saw the evidence of their leader's true methods. Even some of Jeremiah's most loyal followers looked shaken by the graphic reality of what they'd been supporting. "Lies," Jeremiah shouted, but his voice had lost its commanding power. "Fabrications designed to turn you against God's work. And this," Ethan continued, producing another photograph, "is what happens to children who don't survive the spiritual refinement process. The sanctuary, where Jeremiah keeps his failures." The second image showed rows of beds in a dimly lit building, each occupied by a small figure in various states of catatonic withdrawal. Children who'd been broken beyond repair, kept alive as testaments to Jeremiah's cruelty. "My Emily," Sheriff Grimes whispered, recognizing his daughter in one of the beds. "You monster. You've had her for 3 years. And this is what you did to her?" The sight of the sheriff's anguish seemed to break the last vestiges of Jeremiah's control over the crowd. Parents surged forward, demanding answers about their own missing children, while others began backing away from the platform in horror. But Jeremiah wasn't finished. Cornered and desperate, he played his final card. "Gabriel," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Show them the price of betrayal. Prove your loyalty to the path." For a moment, Ethan thought William might falter under the weight of 8 years' conditioning. But then his brother's voice rang out clear and strong. "My loyalty is to the truth. And the truth is that you're nothing but a madman who's convinced people that cruelty is divine will." Jeremiah's face contorted with rage. "Then you've chosen your fate." He pulled something from his robes, not a weapon, but a small silver whistle. The sharp, piercing note that emerged when he blew it carried clearly through the hall. And within moments, armed men began flooding in through the side entrances. Not the confused followers who'd been attending the ceremony, but hardened enforcers who'd been waiting for exactly this signal. "Kill them all," Jeremiah screamed, his careful facade of religious authority finally completely abandoned. "Every traitor, every questioner, every soul too weak to embrace God's harsh mercy." The hall erupted into chaos as gunfire filled the air. But the armed men found themselves facing not just a crowd of panicked civilians, but Sheriff Grimes's federal backup and Mrs. Henderson's network of prepared allies. What Jeremiah had intended as a massacre became a pitched battle. Through the gunfire and screaming, Ethan caught sight of William fighting his way toward the platform's edge, clearly intending to reach the children's dormitory despite the chaos. But several of Jeremiah's enforcers had the same idea. They were moving to secure the compound's most valuable assets before they could be rescued. "Rachel," Ethan shouted over the noise. "Get Rebecca to safety. I have to help William." "No." Rachel grabbed his arm. "We stay together." That was the agreement. But even as she spoke, Rebecca tugged at her mother's dress, pointing toward a side exit. "The children need him," she said with that uncanny certainty. "And Uncle William can't save them alone." Ethan looked at the child, saw the absolute conviction in her eyes, and made his choice. "Go with Rebecca," he told Rachel. "Get somewhere safe and wait for us." Before Rachel could protest further, he was pushing through the crowd toward the platform, following the path William had taken moments before. Behind him, he heard Rachel calling his name, but the sound was swallowed by the chaos of battle. The dormitory was a 5-minute run from the main hall, but it felt like an eternity as Ethan dodged through the compound's pathways. Buildings were beginning to catch fire, whether from overturned lanterns or deliberate arson. He couldn't tell. The night air was thick with smoke and the sounds of violence. He reached the children's building just as William emerged from its rear entrance, carrying a small girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Behind him, other children followed in a ragged line, 11 total, their faces blank with the kind of shock that came from prolonged trauma. "Ethan," William called out with relief. "Thank God. I wasn't sure I could get them all out alone." "Where are the guards?" "Dealt with," William replied grimly. They weren't expecting resistance from someone they trusted. Ethan gathered the nearest children, 2 boys who looked to be brothers, maybe 8 and 10 years old, and began leading them away from the burning compound. But as they reached the edge of the buildings, a figure stepped out of the shadows to block their path. Jeremiah Keller stood before them, his silver hair disheveled, his fine clothes torn and stained with smoke. In his hand, he held a pistol pointed directly at William's chest. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" he asked, his voice carrying the cold fury of absolute conviction. "Did you imagine I would simply allow you to destroy everything I've built?" "It's over, Jeremiah," William said quietly, still holding the small girl protectively. "Your followers have seen the truth. Your influence is broken." "My influence," Jeremiah replied, "extends far beyond this compound. I have allies throughout the territory, agents in positions of power who share my vision of a purified land. Tonight's setback is merely a temporary inconvenience. The federal authorities will find themselves strangely hampered in their investigations." Jeremiah interrupted. "Amazing how evidence can disappear, how witnesses can be discredited, when one has sufficient resources and determination." Ethan understood now why Mrs. Henderson had been so insistent on acting tonight. Why they'd needed to expose Jeremiah publicly before his followers. The man's corruption ran deeper than they'd imagined, his network of influence more extensive than anyone had realized. "But you," Jeremiah continued, his attention focused entirely on William. "You I will deal with personally. You who have enjoyed my protection, my guidance, my investment in your spiritual development, you will learn the price of betrayal." The pistol's hammer clicked back with ominous finality. But before Jeremiah could fire, a small voice cut through the night air. "You're wrong about the children." They turned to see Rebecca walking calmly toward them, apparently having escaped from her mother's protection to find them. In her small hands, she carried one of her drawings, this one showing Jeremiah himself, but not as the commanding figure he believed himself to be. In Rebecca's image, he was small, frightened, surrounded by darkness that seemed to be closing in around him. "What did you say, child?" Jeremiah demanded, though he kept the pistol trained on William. "You're wrong about the children," Rebecca repeated, approaching without any sign of fear. "You think hurting them makes them special, makes them see things, but it doesn't. It just breaks them. And what would you know about it?" Jeremiah sneered. "You're nothing but an untrained vessel. Raw potential that requires proper refinement to—" "I know," Rebecca interrupted, "because I can see what you really are." She held up the drawing, and even in the flickering light of the burning compound, Its message was clear: not a prophet, not a divine messenger, but a frightened man desperately trying to convince himself that his cruelty served some higher purpose. You can't see anything real. Rebecca continued with devastating precision. You can only see what makes you feel powerful. That's why you hurt people, not because God tells you to, but because you're scared of what happens if you stop. For the first time since Ethan had encountered him, Jeremiah Keller looked uncertain. The child's words had found their mark with surgical accuracy, cutting through his elaborate justifications to the core fear that drove everything he did. "Silence," he commanded, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "The Silver Man is afraid," Rebecca said, her young voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Afraid that without scared people to tell him he's special. He's just like everyone else. Just another person who doesn't know what happens when you die." The words hit Jeremiah like physical blows. Ethan could see the man's careful composure cracking. Years of accumulated certainty crumbling in the face of a child's simple truth. "I am chosen," Jeremiah shouted, swinging the pistol toward Rebecca. "I am the voice of divine judgment in this corrupted world." But as he turned, William moved. 8 years of enforcing Jeremiah's will had taught him exactly how the man fought, exactly where his weaknesses lay. Before Jeremiah could complete his turn, William's shoulder caught him in the chest, sending them both tumbling to the ground. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the air as they struggled. But Jeremiah was stronger than his refined appearance suggested, and William was exhausted from the night's events. Gradually, the older man gained the upper hand, his hands closing around William's throat with murderous intent. "I should have let you die 8 years ago," Jeremiah hissed. "Should have recognized your weakness from the beginning." William's vision was beginning to gray at the edges when Ethan's boot connected with Jeremiah's ribs, sending the man rolling away from his victim. But even as William gasped for air, Jeremiah was reaching for the fallen pistol, his face twisted with the fury of a man whose entire world was collapsing around him. "All of you," he screamed, raising the weapon, "all of you will burn for this blasphemy." The shot, when it came, was louder than expected, the deep boom of a rifle rather than the sharp crack of a pistol. Jeremiah staggered, looking down in confusion at the spreading red stain across his chest. The pistol slipped from nerveless fingers as he turned to see Rachel standing at the edge of the clearing, the smoking rifle still raised to her shoulder. "That's for my husband," she said quietly, "and for every child you've broken in the name of your twisted faith." Jeremiah tried to speak, tried to maintain his commanding presence even as his strength ebbed away. But no words came, only a quiet sigh as he collapsed to the ground. The architect of so much suffering finally silenced. In the sudden quiet that followed, Ethan became aware of the children gathered around them, 12 young souls who'd been rescued from Jeremiah's planned ceremony, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion and cautious hope. They were free now, but the scars of their captivity would take years to heal. "It's over," William said, his voice hoarse from Jeremiah's assault. "It's finally over." But even as he spoke, they could hear sounds of fighting continuing throughout the compound. Jeremiah's death had ended the immediate threat, but his network of followers and enforcers would take time to fully dismantle. The path of salvation wouldn't disappear overnight. "No," Rebecca said softly, kneeling beside Jeremiah's body with the solemnity of someone far older than her years. "It's not over. But it's different now. The scary part is finished. But the healing part is just starting." As if summoned by her words, Sheriff Grimes appeared at the head of a group of federal agents, their faces grim but relieved. The battle for the compound was winding down, with most of Jeremiah's enforcers either dead, captured, or fled into the wilderness. "The children," Grimes said, his voice thick with emotion as he recognized several faces among the rescued group. "Are they all right?" "They will be," Ethan replied, though he knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. Given time and proper care, they'll heal. "And the sanctuary?" "Federal agents are already en route," one of Grimes's companions reported. "We'll have those children in proper medical facilities within hours." It was a small victory in the larger war against the kind of predators who used faith as a weapon. But it was still a victory. Lives had been saved, truth had been revealed, and a man who'd caused immeasurable suffering had been stopped. As dawn broke over the Montana territory, Ethan found himself standing once again beside graves, but this time, they were graves he hadn't dug. Jeremiah Keller would be buried in unmarked ground. His legacy one of pain and manipulation rather than the divine purpose he'd claimed to serve. William stood beside him, no longer Gabriel but fully himself for the first time in 8 years. The silver pendant that had marked his captivity lay broken in the ashes of the compound, replaced by nothing more ornate than his own name and the freedom to choose his own path. "What will you do now?" Ethan asked his brother. "Help with the healing," William replied. "There are a lot of people who need to remember who they were before Jeremiah got his hooks into them. A lot of children who need to learn that not all adults will hurt them." "And you?" Rachel asked Ethan, Rebecca sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Will you go back to your farm? Your isolation?" Ethan considered the question, looking out over the valley where the Pat's compound still smoldered. His old life seemed impossibly distant now, the careful routine, the deliberate solitude, the weight of guilt that had shaped every day for 8 years. "I think," he said finally, "it's time I started practicing medicine again. Real medicine, not the kind that comes wrapped in false promises and spiritual manipulation." "The territory needs doctors," Grimes observed, "especially doctors who understand that healing involves more than just treating physical wounds." It was true. The Pat's influence had extended far beyond their immediate followers, creating a network of trauma and broken trust that would take years to address. People would need medical care, but they'd also need proof that authority figures could be trusted, that those with power over life and death could use that power responsibly. "There's a town about 50 miles south," William said. "Pleasant Valley. Good people, mostly, but they've been without a doctor for 3 years. And they're far enough from here that the path never gained much influence." "A fresh start," Rachel mused. "That has appeal. For all of us?" Ethan asked, surprised by how much he hoped the answer would be yes. "If you'll have us," Rachel replied. "Rebecca will need schooling. Proper schooling that teaches her to understand her gift without being afraid of it. And I'd like to try building a life based on choice rather than survival." Ethan looked at the 3 people who'd become his family through shared danger and mutual protection. A brother returned from the dead, a woman who'd fought for her daughter's freedom, and a child whose visions had guided them all through the darkness. "Pleasant Valley it is," he said, as they prepared to leave the compound behind. Rebecca stirred in her mother's arms and looked up with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see so much more than a 7-year-old should. "Are we going home now?" she asked sleepily. "Yes," Ethan replied, understanding for the first time in years what that word really meant. "We're going home." The sun climbed higher into a clear Montana sky as they walked away from the ashes of Jeremiah Keller's empire. Behind them lay years of pain and manipulation and spiritual captivity. Ahead lay the uncertain but hopeful prospect of building something better, not a perfect life, but an honest one. In the distance, church bells were ringing from the towns throughout the territory, not the single commanding note that had called people to Jeremiah's ceremonies, but a harmony of different voices joining together in celebration of freedom reclaimed. The fire had come, just as Rebecca had foreseen. But what burned were lies, not lives. What rose from the ashes was hope, not despair. And for the first time in 8 long years, Dr. Ethan Blackwood walked toward the future without the weight of unearned guilt upon his shoulders, carrying instead the lighter but more precious burden of love freely given and responsibility willingly accepted. The healing could begin. 1 year later, Dr. Ethan Blackwood finished examining his last patient of the day, a ranch hand who'd taken a bad fall from his horse but would recover fully with proper rest. As the man departed with instructions to return in a week, Ethan reflected on how different his practice had become from his military days. Here in Pleasant Valley, healing meant taking time with each person, understanding not just their physical ailments but the circumstances that surrounded them. The town had welcomed them warmly, grateful for both the doctor and the quiet leadership that William provided as their new minister. Unlike Jeremiah's thunderous demands for submission, William's sermons focused on practical compassion, on the daily choices that built community rather than the grand gestures that demanded sacrifice. Rachel had opened a school, teaching not just reading and arithmetic but critical thinking, the ability to question authority. to distinguish between genuine wisdom and manipulative rhetoric. Rebecca attended her mother's classes but also worked with Ethan, learning to understand her gift as a form of heightened empathy rather than supernatural prophecy. Dr. Blackwood? A young voice interrupted his thoughts. Timothy Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's grandson, peered around the doorframe. Ma says to tell you there's a telegram. Ethan nodded, following the boy to the telegraph office where Mrs. Henderson waited with a yellow slip of paper. Her expression was troubled, and Ethan felt a familiar tightness in his chest. From Sheriff Grimes, she said, handing him the message. About the trial. Ethan read quickly, his expression growing grim. 3 months had passed since the surviving members of Jeremiah's inner circle had been brought to trial in Helena. The evidence had been overwhelming: testimonies from rescued children, financial records documenting fraud and extortion, medical documentation of the injuries inflicted during purification ceremonies. But money and influence die hard. And Jeremiah's network had been more extensive than anyone realized. Appeals had been filed, evidence had been challenged, and now, acquitted, Ethan said quietly, all charges dismissed on technicalities. Mrs. Henderson's face reflected his own disappointment. Politics, she said bitterly. Judge Morrison has financial ties to some of Jeremiah's business associates. Should have seen it coming. So they just walk free? For now. Mrs. Henderson folded the telegram carefully. But Grimes says the federal investigation is continuing. They're building a stronger case, gathering evidence from other territories where the path operated. It wasn't the justice they'd hoped for. But it wasn't defeat either. The compound remained closed. The children had been returned to their families or placed in proper care. And the network of fear Jeremiah had built was broken even if some of his followers remained free. Dr. Blackwood? Another voice called from the doorway. Rebecca, carrying her school books and wearing the careful expression she adopted when sharing her visions. Can I talk to you? They walked together toward the small house Ethan shared with Rachel and Rebecca. The evening air cool with the promise of autumn. Rebecca was quiet for several minutes, gathering her thoughts in the deliberate way that had become second nature to her. I had a dream, she said finally, about the men who got away from the trial. Ethan felt that familiar chill. What did you see? They're not done being bad people, Rebecca said with the matter-of-fact tone she used for difficult truths. But they're not as powerful anymore. And there are other people, good people, who are watching them now. Other people like Sheriff Grimes? Like Sheriff Grimes, but not just him. People who lost things because of the Silver Man. People who want to make sure it doesn't happen again. Rebecca kicked at a small stone, sending it skittering down the dusty road. It's going to take a long time. But they're going to be stopped. Really stopped. And what about us? Ethan asked. What do you see for Pleasant Valley? Rebecca's smile was the first truly carefree expression he'd seen from her since the night they'd met. Safe, she said simply. Different kinds of safe for different people. But safe. As they reached their house, Ethan could see Rachel through the kitchen window, preparing dinner with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything she did. William sat at the table, reviewing notes for Sunday's sermon, his face peaceful in a way it had never been during his years as Gabriel. This was what they'd built from the ashes of Jeremiah's empire, not perfect lives, but honest ones, not a grand victory over evil, but the daily choice to treat each other with dignity and respect. Dr. Blackwood? Rebecca tugged at his sleeve, pulling him back from his thoughts. Thank you. For what, sweetheart? For not running away when we needed you to be brave. The simple words carried more weight than any medal or commendation Ethan had ever received. This was what healing really meant, not the dramatic rescue or the climactic battle, but the patient work of rebuilding trust, one person at a time. As they entered the house together, Ethan reflected on the brass key that still hung around his neck. Sarah's final gift had never been opened. That safe deposit box in Denver still waiting for him to find the courage to face whatever memories it contained. But tonight, for the first time since her death, he thought he might be ready. Not because the past had been erased, but because the present was worth living. Some wounds never fully healed. But sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, you could build something beautiful around the scars. Outside, the church bells of Pleasant Valley rang the evening hour, not a call to judgment or submission, but a simple reminder that another day had passed in peace, and another would follow in hope. The fire had come and gone. What remained was light.